Hey, what's up everyone? DREAGEN back again, here to tell you that you should be watching Stranger Things. So Stranger Things is a 2016 and ongoing Netflix series written and created by the Duffer Brothers, and essentially is a love letter to kind of 80s kind of creature feature movies, and or like Stephen King novels. Kind of basically just that decade of kind of like sci-fi, horror, mystery, kind of intrigue. For a lot of you who might be from that decade, or kind of like from my generation, where you're born in the 80s and then would discover these films at your local video store on VHS, and we would just kind of rent them and pour through them. You would dig around in the sci-fi fantasy section of the store and just kind of find all these treasure troves, everything from aliens to Pumpkinhead to Critters to Gremlins. The list goes on. I'm sure there's a million of them I'm missing right now. That I find myself trying to think of all different John Carpenter's The Thing, so on and so forth. And again, the above, mentioned Stephen King novels. And essentially, the story takes place in 1983. The first season does, anyway. And there's this laboratory here, and there's something gets loose. Two things get loose here. This young girl who is named 11, played by the now very famous Millie Bobby Brown, escapes, falls in line with a group of neighborhood kids. They kind of all have a bit of a Goonies vibe here. And essentially, find out that she is part of an experiment at this strange facility. She has these psychic telekinetic capabilities. And that this laboratory is kind of a gateway to what is known as the Upside Down, this kind of mirror world or dark dimension, this parallel universe where something has come through. And the Upside Down is essentially a metaphor for the Shadowfell from like Dungeons and Dragons. And you'll see these guys, they play D&D. And a lot of what is going on, it's like a metaphor for kind of, Dungeons and Dragons. There's a creature that is coming from the Upside Down that they've named the Demogorgon, which is for any of you guys who play Dungeons and Dragons or are just familiar with Dungeons and Dragons lore, is kind of one of the classic big beasties from, this game. Bears no resemblance to the Demogorgon, nowhere nearly as dangerous, as powerful, but the fact that they kind of refer to it as that, using Dungeons and Dragons as kind of a guideline in which they kind of make sense of what's going on. And this continues on in season 2, utilizing the concept of the mind flayers for the big bad of that. And at the time of this recording, season 3 has yet to start. It is a couple weeks away, maybe not even that. But essentially, again, this is a story that takes place in the 80s, and focuses heavily on kind of the themes and ideas that you saw in a lot of these kind of creature features from that time period. And one of the big takeaways from Stranger Things is this notion of secret goings on. It was still during the Cold War, and it was this idea where Americans had this, almost in a weirdly, now looking back on it, romanticized notion of kind of monsters in the basement in terms of the U.S. government, or the idea of that. It's no secret that yes, the governments of the world have top secret things, classified things. They are developing things that we, don't know about or are not allowed to know about, and you can make the argument that it's for our own safety, what have you. But while we still hold true to that notion today, I think what a lot of people think is going on is a lot more realistic. Whereas back in that time period, we were so paranoid, and we didn't have, for instance, even the internet, or the world was not connected the way it was today. So we felt more isolated. We felt more cut off. It was harder to have watchdogs keep an eye on the government than it was, today. We assumed that everyone was a spy, everyone was the government. That while we were afraid of, what was happening across the pond. With that other government, that we weren't too friendly with at the time, and seems unfortunately like that's kind of the case today. We were also very distrusting of our own government. So we had this notion of, what the government might be up to, what kinds of things they might be doing, and this spawned a lot of topics for movies of like secret experiments of making monsters or uncovering monsters, things, the idea of like something really nefarious and out there happening. And it was kind of this era of like extreme paranoia and like the wow of this story, the wow of this conspiracy theory, traveled the furthest. It's like, nowadays conspiracy theories are, the moon landing was a fake. I know that one's been going on for a while, but back then it was like, they're making monsters, they're making creatures, they're going to replace soldiers on the battlefield with things with teeth and claws. It was a much more kind of surreal era of conspiracy theory, kind of, and it lent itself really well to movies, and you saw that kind of translate into film. And it was a decade of when you saw these kinds of stories, because that was kind of the general atmosphere going on. So Stranger Things is essentially, people, Duffer Brothers my age, grew up watching those films and wanted to kind of make a love letter and kind of really show that now that the 80s was long enough ago where it's less retro and now more of a period piece. Stranger Things is in fact a period piece, and it is, while on the surface a cool sci-fi horror story, it is also a snapshot into kind of the mentality of America during the 1980s and kind of our fear and our paranoia, but also our willingness to kind of immerse ourselves in the imaginative. There was so many imaginative stories coming out of the 80s, so you combine that fear and paranoia with that, and you got these really fun and creative stories, that really came out of that decade. So when you're making a story like this about, again, what I like to refer as monsters in the basement, it makes sense to put it in the 80s, because in the 80s, that's the kind of stuff that, was, people were, thinking. I'm not saying everyone thought, the government was making monsters, or knew about monsters or something like that, but it was this idea of like extreme distrust and paranoia, and you can't even trust your own government, what's going on, this kind of feeding into, and these kids growing up in a time without the internet, without social media, where they didn't have facts in the palm of their hand, where they were just kind of lost and confused like the rest of us. So it's this fun decade to realize that the reason why these kids are able to kind of stumble upon this is because their imaginations are going wild. It's just in this case, it's actually true. So it is a celebration of an era, a decade of, where you didn't feel foolish for believing in the possibility of something extraordinary happening, because you weren't constantly being bombarded by, again, facts in the palm of your hand in some kind of device, whether it's your phone or whatever. There was no way to really fact check yourself, so you kind of just fell down the rabbit hole of again, paranoia and imagination. And while at the time perhaps not the healthiest thing, in retrospect, again, it led to a lot of really fun and elaborate stories. And it is also a story of rebellion, in the sense that these kids are supposed to trust in the adults, just as the adults are supposed to trust in the system, the government. And then the government, you find out, is lying. The government is not have the people's best interest at heart, and that trickles all the way down to the kids. So it's a story of realizing, it's about growing up, really. And a lot of these stories in the 80s were kind of coming of age tales where kids were growing up, and you realize that you have to start thinking for yourself. You have to start making decisions for yourself, and you have to start trusting your own gut, your own instincts. Because if you always think that someone else is looking out for you, eventually you're going to have the rug pulled out from underneath. Eventually you're going to be caught unawares, because you're going to just blindly trust everyone because you're supposed to. And in the 80s, that's what we were being told. It's like, trust your government, trust the system, don't question it. And that's when people started questioning it, because again, people started to kind of realize that, maybe Uncle Sam isn't always looking out for us. Maybe systems of authority that are put in place don't always have our best interests at heart, even if they're supposed to. So again, these kids kind of going behind the adults' back and looking into what's going on, and helping this mysterious girl. It's a metaphor for an age when we started to question everything. when we started to question the status quo, when we started to look at all these systems of control and authority that were put in place and ask ourselves, should we be following them so blindly? Should we be fact-checking them? Should we be, at the same time, listening to what they're saying, taking it under advisement, but also then drawing our own conclusions and not just blindly being led just because, well, that's what the government says and that's what we should do. Again, this was a decade when we started to question everything, for better or for worse. But ultimately, I think for the better. But yeah, so it is. I know. So one of the reasons why I held off talking about Stranger Things for so long is not because we've watched it since the beginning. But again, I kind of think it was one of those things that was just so popular that you guys didn't need me recommending it to you. If you haven't checked it out by now, you probably won't. But in case you haven't, I wanted to come on and do that because now I've since then started recommending other big mainstream, things. Last you should be watching was Godzilla King of the Monsters, which also stars Millie Bobby Brown, so if you haven't seen that, definitely watch it. But again, it is a fun story, and for me, it is the kind of story that I grew up watching. I think these kinds of movies were huge, huge influences on me, and one of the reasons why I wanted to become a creative person. Watching these kinds of movies inspired me to want to become a storyteller myself, and that's, one of the reasons why I started writing books, is, I wanted to kind of come up with something imaginative and put it out there. So it's a lot of fun, and it's also a great example of something that doesn't have like a huge, gigantic budget, and how you're able to do a lot of it with just really great characters, and a really fun, compelling story. And also, with the success of Stranger Things, have maybe a new generation of people discovering these films, the films that inspired this show, and kind of seeing where it all came from, and really seeing the films that not just are meant to take place during the decade, but actually were made during that decade. And Stranger Things does a great job of feeling like it's from that decade, even though it's using some modern day special effects. It doesn't take you out of it because it really feels like a period piece. But yeah, so Stranger Things. Sure, most of you have seen it, realistically. But if you haven't, it is streaming on Netflix. I think there's some places where you can buy it on home media. I'll check, and if so, I'll put links in the description where you can pick it up, check it out. But I'm sure a lot of you at least have Netflix, so your access to it should not be an issue. But yeah, definitely check. If you have not seen it, check it out. Come back. Give me some of your thoughts. Again, at the time of this recording, season 3 is just around the corner. If you have seen Stranger Things, what do you guys think? Do you like it? Are you like me, where you're kind of born in the 80s but kind of grew up in the 90s, so you kind of discovered all these films on VHS? Did you grow up in the 80s and were around when all this stuff was mainstream and you kind of were living that atmosphere that was the 1980s? Give me some of your thoughts and just let me know how you feel the show kind of accurately, or maybe not accurately, represents that decade for you. But anyway, guys, as always, thank you so much for watching, and I will catch you in the next one. Peace!